My name is Brian Dilg. I'm the learning manager for Cryengine. I can't answer every question you possibly have, but my job today is to get you started with the interface, what we call the Sandbox Editor. So normally, when an end user goes to cryengine.com, the first thing they download is what we call the launcher. It's like a project management system. It shows all the projects you've created, it shows all the assets that you've downloaded from our marketplace, and it shows the versions of the engine that you have installed. Here are some projects that I've already set up to get us started. For example, I've put something called GameSDK, which I'll talk about a little bit later. These are things that I've downloaded from the marketplace. The most important thing as far as you're concerned is the engine version that you have installed. So you'll see that you can install any older version of the engine. We're using the latest version, which is 5.6.3. And normally, in order to even get it installed, you actually create a project that's specific to that engine version, and then it installs the engine. You have to do that once. There are sort of faster ways to deal with things. So if you go to this folder, that is where the engine has been installed. And I'm showing you this because I'm going to show you how we usually kind of go into our projects. So your projects don't have to be installed in the same folder as the engine. They can live in their own folder. You're going to want them on a local drive, preferably an SSD, of course, because these things are big. But for instance, there are templates for projects. So if you open up this folder called templates, you'll see that there are three categories here: C++, C#, and schematic. Schematic was a prototype for what's going to become our new visual scripting language. So when you open up one of these templates, and let's say, for instance, the blank one, if you were to want to open the actual project, this is what you would double click on. .cry project is the actual Cryengine project. Don't confuse it with a level. You may use multiple levels within a project. This opens the entire project, and as you'll see within that, there may be many levels, or maybe only one. However, there are more things that you can do other than just launch it. So right-click on the Cry project file. And this is the stuff that I really want to point out. You can tell it to launch in the editor, which is what we're going to do today. And when you're ready to test it, you can also launch it what we call in-game. In other words, the finished game, the executable that you will output as your finished product. And there are other things that you can do here. You can do what's called packaging. When we get to C++, you're going to want to generate a solution. You can open the solution in Visual Studio, start to modify and extend the code. These are what we call shell extensions. If you go back up to the C++ folder, so that we have something to play with. Otherwise, this would be a very boring sandbox tutorial. We would have no assets. We have no objects other than primitives, right? A box, a sphere, a cylinder. We'd have no materials, no objects, nothing to kind of build a level and see how physics work and that sort of thing. I've put some assets in this folder, first-person shooter. I just used that template. I could have used any one of them. So if you go into there and into this folder called Assets, Assets is where everything that you add to your project will be put. You can also call that folder something else. It doesn't have to be called Assets. But in there, you'll see that I have these compressed files in a format called .pack. You know, zip files. This is kind of a Cryengine-friendly format. And these assets are from our GameSDK. It's based on an old game called Crisis 2, which was a first-person shooter game. But it has some buildings and characters, props, things that we can play with. You'll also see that there are folders that have been created as suggestions about how to organize your assets. Organization, I don't have to tell you, is going to be super, super important because you'll probably have thousands of assets. And for instance, materials is an interesting question. Generic materials like this carpet that I could use in many different buildings, I might want to put in the materials folder. But if I have a specific building and a specific room, and the only place I'll use that carpet is this room, I might want to put it in the same folder as the object model. There's nothing in Cryengine that forces you to put anything anywhere, except it has to be in this assets folder. Beyond that, this is up to you. Just because this is called materials, you could put particle effects in there. It probably wouldn't be very smart because you're going to confuse yourself and your team. But make some decisions how you want to organize it and stick with it. All right, so what we want to do is open our Cry project file, which is back up here one level in the first-person shooter template. And you can either double-click or you can right-click and say Launch Editor. It's going to do exactly the same thing. Yep. And that launcher will also start automatically when you launch the sandbox. You can minimize it. It's not something you're ever going to look at. Just a brief look at the tools. Every tool in Cryengine is in the tools menu, not too surprisingly. And there are a lot of tools. To me, this doesn't look as complicated as 3D Max or Maya, which have so many tiny buttons and so many tiny pop-up menus, but it's a very big program. It has 3D modeling and it has much, much more. There is probably no job that you could ever get where you would need all of these tools. You may be responsible for level design, you may be responsible for particle effects, audio. Fortunately, you're never going to have to use all of these because it just takes a team to build a simulation or a game. But anything that you want to make visible that isn't, just turn it on. So for instance, I don't have my material editor open. I could click this and open it. And by default, the first time you use Cryengine, this will come up as a floating window. So the first thing I want to show you is how to arrange these windows. There are many ways to do it, and I hope you'll have more than one monitor. So here's the thing. If you drag the title bar, you'll see these little helpers. Do you see the 5 boxes in the middle? So I can drag this onto another window. For instance, here's my 3D perspective viewport, and this is a tabbed arrangement. So now I have 2 windows that are stacked in a tab view. If you want to drag it out again, just drag the name of the tool and you can drag it out. If you want to split horizontally or vertically, you use this guy. And there are 2 ways to do this. So I can put a horizontal split within this sub-window, or I can go across the entire screen by coming all the way to the bottom, and now it goes all the way across the entire monitor. Pretty straightforward, but maybe not obvious the first time you do it. Every one of these tools also has a menu, and in 5.6 we've made them much more neat. They're hiding in this little menu bar right here. So in the top right-hand corner of every tool is a menu. Some of them are very short, some of them are very long. Of course, if you want to close something, you can just right-click. So for instance, like this, and just choose Close, which is the only thing that pops up. Okay, so we see nothing. We see no world because we have no level open. So let's create one. For this, we're going to go File, New, not a big surprise, and not Project. That's what we already have open, but we're going to choose Level. If you want to create an entirely different project, you can do it from within the current project, but it's going to open another instance of the Sandbox Editor, which is fine, except that you don't really want to have 2 versions of Cryengine running at the same time. So once you get the new one open, you'll want to close the old one. This is another reason why people do use the launcher, because it makes it easy to switch between projects. But there's nothing wrong about doing this and saying, well, I want to make a side scroller, blah, blah, blah. And it'll say, hey, I'm going to run another instance of the sandbox. And you say, that's OK. But don't run more than one unless you have to. So new level. Obviously, it would make sense to keep it in the levels folder under assets. You'll notice that you can't go above assets, or whatever you've decided to call your assets folder. It's the same folder as .cry project. You can't see outside of it. That's your top level folder. So make sure your levels folder is selected, and I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to call mine Sandbox Tutorial. Here's the first tip about Cryengine. Don't use spaces. Never, 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 never. Use underscores, use a dash. We like underscores. Don't use spaces in asset names, object names, nothing. Just avoid it. Click OK. And then we're going to get this dialog box that says, how big should the height map be, the playable area of the game? The world of a Cryengine project is not limited. There are no limits that I know of. You can put mountains, 100 kilometers from the middle of the game. But the playable terrain, the playable area where physics is normal, is 8 kilometers by 8 kilometers. Now, there are tricky ways to extend that using what's called a grid, an entity grid. Just remember that the height map is just a plane of points. It has no depth. It's not, I don't know if you know what voxelization is. If I take a shovel and dig into the ground, I see dirt and I can dig a tunnel, right? But if you go under the height map, there's nothing. It's infinitely thin. It just is a grid of points, and each point has a height map. And so then we can make hills or underwater terrain or mountains, whatever we want to do. The height map itself is a huge asset. It takes up a lot of memory. So you don't want to make your terrain height map bigger than absolutely necessary. This default 1K is the same as our game Hunt, which some of you may have played. And it's surprising how much you can pack onto 1 kilometer of territory. The terrain textures have their own settings. So if you're using terrain and you want to paint it with sand and grass and dirt and leaves and that sort of thing, the resolution, the maximum resolution of those textures is right here on texture dimensions. I'm just going to choose this. You can also make the terrain height map more precise. The default units is 1 point every meter. You can make it half a meter, a quarter meter, and make a very precise height map. If you're importing data from LiDAR scans, where a plane flies overhead with a laser, I don't think their accuracy is higher than 1 meter anyway. In any case, you have some options here. We're just going to choose 1 meter and 1K texture dimension, and you'll notice that the height map resolution is here, and everything else we don't need to worry about. Just click OK. It'll take it a minute to generate it, and finally we see our 3D world. So we're going to need a couple of things. Make sure that this tool, Create Object, is visible on your screen. And we want a tool called Level Explorer. And I'm actually going to put my Level Explorer under my Create Object tool, like this. And I'm going to dock this over here. I'm just going to rearrange my tools a little bit. In the beginning, you're going to be doing a lot of creating objects because we have nothing. Here's our terrain height map. The thick black lines show 1 meter dimensions, and then it's divided down into 10 centimeters, 25 centimeters, etc. The modern way that we create objects, assets in Cryengine, is through entity components. If you look at this Create Object panel here, where we're going to spend most of our time, where we're most interested in, is this thing called components. You'll notice this thing called empty entity. If I select empty entity and click anywhere on the terrain, I should get one of these little purple guys. If you don't see that, you want to make sure that your helpers are on, and that's this button labeled H at the top right corner of your perspective viewport. The helpers are the invisible things that the player doesn't see, that shows you the outlines, the bounding boxes, all kinds of parameters, and invisible entities. Without the helpers, you won't see this at all. So this is just a container for logic and physical elements. Also, if you like keyboard shortcuts, it's Control H. That's one you'll probably use a lot, and it's like a light switch. It toggles the helpers on and off. There is nothing there. It is an empty container. We don't need to use this empty entity. We can just start adding components. So this is one optional way. If you like to think of, I need this container and I want to put my bottle inside it, and I want to give it mass, or maybe I want to have a light inside it. Those are all components. Components can include physics, physical elements, lights, particle effects, anything you can think of. So with this selected, I'm going to go over here to my Properties window. And you'll see in the Level Explorer, the default name is Entity 1. Of course, we can rename it. And let's give it some physical shape. So I'm going to click on Add Component, Geometry, Mesh. And by default, you're going to have a sphere, just a primitive sphere. And it's probably going to be stuck halfway down into the terrain. A mesh is a 3D model. Probably the first thing you're going to want to do is be able to manipulate the object. So there are 4 tools. We can select the object, we can move it, we can spin it, rotate, and we can scale it. We can make it bigger. You use these tools so much that we made the keyboard shortcuts 1, 2, 3, 4. Move, rotate, scale, select. And they are here on their own toolbar. If you don't see this toolbar, then you'll need to right-click on the toolbars and make sure that this one is here. This is called Standard. Select is 4, Move is 1, Rotate is 2, and Scale is 3. So for instance, press the 1 key and select the object, and you should have these arrows, and you'll notice that on the 3 axes you can move it on the y-axis, x, or z. So you can lift it up out of the terrain and just put it up in the air maybe a couple of meters. The other thing is, now that we have something to look at, you want to be able to navigate with your camera. The camera that you're using right now is the default Sandbox camera. You can't see it. It's not a physical entity, but you see what it sees. So you guys probably know from games, W moves forward, S moves back, A moves left, D moves right. And you can hold them down at the same time if you like. You can hold WA, WD, etc., as long as they don't contradict. And if you do this, you may quickly get very, very far away from your object, or even if you go way, way back, you'll see the entire height map like this. And I'll show you how I did it so quickly in a second. So here's a trick. to find an object that's lost. You can't see it, but you know it's there somewhere. Find it in the Level Explorer if you know its name. In this case, it's easy because there's only one object. Click on it to select it, if it isn't already. If you click on it a second time, you're going to get into renaming it, so don't do that. Select it, and then we're going to say go to that entity. Move the camera so it's right in front of the entity, and that's G. I can't press G while I'm in this tool. I have to make this window my active window. But the problem is, if I click somewhere on the active window, perspective viewport, I deselect the object. Do you see? It's no longer selected. I select it in Level Explorer, and to make this window active without deselecting, click on the gray bar. Now perspective viewport is my active window, and I can press G, but I haven't deselected the object. And I would promise to tell you how I moved so quickly. So the camera speed can be set right here. Click on the word camera under the word perspective, and you'll see this scroll bar here. So this slider controls how fast the camera moves. To be honest, I don't touch it very often because there are easier ways. So just watch for a second. I'm way up in the air. I'm way up in the air. Once I start moving with WASD, then I can use the scroll wheel on the mouse to change the speed as I move. So if I go up, I go faster and faster. If I go down, I go slower and slower. And you'll notice that it actually shows you the adjustment. As I'm doing it, it pops up right here. It says speed. You're adjusting the speed. There are also 3 shortcuts for slow, medium, and fast right next to here. Slow, medium, fast. So that's another good way to kind of get your camera speed working. Here's another great camera trick. I'm going to press G to go to the object. It's very common to orbit the camera around the object. However, with a sphere, it's going to be hard to see that anything is happening. We'll see the background move, but the keyboard shortcut is hold down the Alt key with your free hand and use the middle mouse button. So your scroll wheel, just press straight down and you can orbit the camera around the object without moving the camera. You get into a complex model like a ship or a plane, how does it look from below, etc. Very good idea to get in the habit of saving before you do something big. Before you make a big change, that's a really good time to save. It's above the surface, so I can see it's making a shadow. You'll notice that the light is coming from above, and I have my terrain underneath. So my question now is, I have this model of a ball. Is this object a physical object? Will it behave like a real object in the real world? Well, game engines simulate the real world. There's gravity, there's wind, there's sun, etc. So by default, the physics are off because physics is very intensive. It takes a lot of computer power to calculate. So we're not seeing physics right now. If we want to turn that on, we can use my favorite key, which is Control P. That's a key worth knowing. Or you can use this button right here on this toolbar, which is called Enable Physics and AI. Not the button next to it, which is Game Mode. We don't want to do that yet. But just Enable Physics. When you click on it or press Control P, nothing is going to happen except this little red flash, which is not something you need to worry about. It's because of the assets I put in there. Gravity has now been turned on. All the physics are on. Why is the ball not falling? It's a model, but it has no mass. It's not what we call a rigid body, and it's not a soft body either. It has no physical properties other than the definition of this mesh. So let's fix that. In order to change that, we're going to add a rigid body component. So you can turn off your physics. Make sure that this button is back to play, right? This little button. And we're going to click on Add Component again. And this time we're going to go to the physics group and we're going to add what's called a rigid body. By the way, you'll notice a search bar at the top of Add Component. As you start to get familiar with the components, it's much faster just to type the name, unless you really love the mouse. Scroll down. Here's a little tip. Do you see that there's mass here at the bottom of the mesh properties? That doesn't have any effect until we tell it that it is a physicalized entity. We add this rigid body component. If this is kind of foreign language to you, don't worry about it. You'll see what I mean. So now that we have the rigid body added, if we turn on our physics, the ball falls to the ground. Gravity accelerates it 9.8 meters per second, and now it behaves like a real world object. because we added the rigid body and we have a mass of 10 kilograms, by the way. It's all metric units. Do you see it rolling on the ground? Do you know why? It's because of the wind. So by default, the wind is on, and normally we wouldn't turn it off completely because it creates atmospheric pressure. If we set the wind to 0 on all 3 axes, we have no atmospheric pressure. It's one of the little tricky things about Cryengine. But I want to call your attention to something very, very important. You can think about entities, these objects, having 2 types, things that move and things that don't. Super important distinction. If I have a mountain or a building or something, unless I'm simulating earthquakes, I don't need these things to move. It's a waste of computer power to calculate physics on things that don't move. Do you see my point? That we call a brush, and we'll add some of them. So the more complex things are things that move, and they also collide, and they can affect each other, right? They have physics. So there's a property under the rigid body called resting. Can you turn that on? And now preview your physics, turn on your physics again, and the ball hangs in the air because it is resting until something touches it, until a force acts on it. So here's my favorite tool ever invented, which is the physics tool. We can use the mouse as like a hammer, like a fist. We can bump things, we can pull things. And it's right up here, this tool right here on the physics toolbar. If you don't see this toolbar, right-click on any toolbar and turn on physics. And turn on this tool. And now the mouse is like a hammer. So if I touch this thing, it falls. I can push it, I can pull it, I can push it sideways. I want to point out something super useful. If you grab and hold the mouse on an entity, it shows you the weight, it shows you the mass. Really useful thing to know. So it's a very kind of comforting confirmation of its property. By the way, if the ball gets away from you, if you pull it way away, just turn the physics off and turn it on again, it'll go back to its start position. So in other words, what the player does to the objects, moving the objects in the game, is not permanent. We're not changing its position permanently. Really important that you remember, turn off the physics preview. Don't modify your world. Don't modify entity properties with the physics running, because often that is temporary. Also, if you want to manipulate objects using move and rotate and scale, you need to escape or cancel the pull physics tool. Do you see this pull physics is on right now? This is a really important thing to notice because there are many tools that have this little title at the top of the bar, and if you forget to turn off the tool, you're still linking or you're still pulling, and you can get very confused about why things are behaving the way they are. You can just escape. If you press the escape key, is a very easy way to cancel one of those tools. I'm going to copy and paste the object. Control-C, Control-V. Control-C, Control-V. And now I've got exactly in the same place entity 3 in my case, because I deleted one at one point. It doesn't reuse the same numbers, but we can rename them later. Let's move it. I'm going to move it down a bit, just so I can see that it's a separate entity. And I want to change the model. I don't want a sphere, I want a box. So we're going to go to the mesh property. And you'll notice that there's File. And if you click in this box, you'll notice that this is in a folder called Engine Assets, Objects, and it's primitiveSphere.cgf, Cryengine graphics format, a 3D model. So what I want to do, since I don't want to type the name, is I'm going to click on the little folder next to it, not the one with the pencil, but the folder all the way on the right, and browse to the same directory. And I'm going to select cube in this case. By the way, you know the Windows trick, hold down Control and use your scroll wheel, changes the size of the thumbnails. So choose cube, and now I have the same rigid body, but now I have a different mesh. Here's what I want to do. I want this box to rest on the terrain, to rest on the ground realistically, as if gravity was holding it there. There's 2 ways to do this. I can do Control-Shift-Click, and it will snap to the terrain. It may not do exactly what you expect it to do, because half of the box is going to be underground. If you grab the rotate or the move tool or the scale tool, you'll notice that the arrows come out of the middle of the entity. If you use that trick to orbit around, you'll notice that that thing, what we call the pivot, is right in the middle of the box. And when we say snap the terrain, which is Control-Shift-Click, it snaps the pivot to the terrain. And this isn't something you can change. You can't modify the pivot without going into a program like Max or Maya and modifying the model. So what's a way that I could get it to sit on the ground? Well, what I'm going to do is turn off the resting property on this thing. I'm going to enable my physics, and it falls to the ground and sits there naturally. But I want to make this permanent. I want to capture the current position of this and move the object to where it fell. Wherever it landed, that's where I want it to live. And so we have this wonderful button on the physics toolbar called Get Physics State here, specifically for the selected object or objects. So now, after I do that, you're not going to see anything happen until I turn physics off, and you'll see now the object is stuck there. It's now permanently on the ground. Turn off resting, turn on physics, let it fall, get physics state, and now turn your physics off and on again. Do the same thing with the ball. Let the ball fall onto the box. You can kind of move it to the side a little bit, and wherever it ends up, I want you to make it permanent, so the ball kind of lands naturally. Where I find this really nice is if, let's say I want to have debris, like there's been an accident, or I want the level to feel like someone, like a human being came along and sort of just threw something and it landed in a natural way. It bounced off the desk and it fell on the floor and it rolled up to another desk. If you want that natural chaos that's physics driven, this is the way to do it. Get physics state. I use it all the time. I mentioned just a couple tricks on the level explorer. If you want to rename an object, you can either right click and say rename or just click on it a second time. Be aware that if you double click, that's go to object, like G. It's not the same thing. So you have to leave a little bit of time between your two clicks. You click a second time and now you can rename the object. Same idea as with anything else in Cryengine. Try not to use spaces. You'll also notice that there's something called main, and that is a layer. You can have many, many, many layers inside Cryengine, and you can also have folders. So if you look at the Level Explorer's menu here, you can organize your objects into folders, and the layers can be inside those folders. And I don't think we nest. I don't think we have, it's just one level deep. You can hide an entire layer, and you can hide individual objects. So here's another trick. Let's say I have this box here. I have it where I want it, and I don't want to accidentally grab it. As I'm kind of designing my level, I'm moving things around, and the world starts to get very busy with hundreds or thousands of objects. You can freeze the object so it can't be selected. And you can either use the F key or you can use this little icon in Level Explorer, this little lock. Freezes the object. And now it cannot be selected. And you'll notice that the helper, this little container thing, is sort of a darker color. Same thing with hide, right? H is hide. Shift H is unhide everything. Shift F is unfreeze everything. It doesn't do individual objects because you can't select it first. So if you want to unfreeze one object, do it in the Level Explorer. So for instance, I'm just going to, for clarity, rename my box a cube. And I'm going to rename my ball, ball 1. I want to take this ball and I want to turn it into a pyramid. So the same thing, we go to our mesh, find the file, and browse to that same folder, and you'll see that there's a pyramid here. Should look like that. And I'm doing this because I want to constrain the movement of this thing. Rather than just gravity acting on it, I want to make it move in specific ways. Before we do that, though, you'll notice that by default, in the world of Cryengine, the sun is directly overhead. It's like we're at the equator at high noon. The sun is directly above us, and it makes it kind of hard to see the shape of things because the shadow is directly below the object. Do you see what I mean? So the way that we change that is in the Environment Editor. So Tools, Environment Editor. This is a huge tool, so I'm going to dock it along the bottom of the screen like this so that I can see my perspective viewport and I can also see my Environment Editor. And what I want to do is make a new preset. So I'm going to come to this little menu in the upper right-hand corner. And the only kind of asset that I can make in the Environment Editor is an environment preset, not surprisingly. And I'm going to give it a name. Again, Sandbox Tutorial. You can call it anything. You might want to call it morning or afternoon or sunset, because fundamentally what we're going to do is change the time of day. We can also change our latitude and our longitude with respect to the position of the sun. Before we get into changing the environment, for 1 second, I want to point out something I probably should have showed you sooner. When I have an object selected, if you look at the properties over here at the top, we have what's called transform. And the most important basic information is where is the object? And this is relative to the terrain height map. There are 3 ways to change a value. The most obvious way is literally to click and type a number, but it's also the slowest. If you want to do it more visually, you can literally drag. Don't click first, just drag, and I'm literally changing the value and I can see the object moving. You just drag back and forth on the number. If I'm kind of roughly trying to get it in position, I will often do this. Okay, I'm just not so concerned about precision, I just want to do it visually. Once I get precise, then I'm going to go in and type a value. The other way to modify the value is using these up and down arrows, and they move in 1/10 of a meter, so 10 centimeters at a time, like this. Same thing at the rotation. If I come in here and start rotating the object, you select the rotation tool with the 2 key, you'll notice that there are 3 axes, just like with the move tool, but they look like arcs. Yellow is it moves in all directions at once. If I want to spin it around the vertical axis, which is Z in Cryengine, it's the white one. If I'm not sure which is which, as I do it, I can see the numbers changing as I rotate it. Red is X, green is Y. If you're a Max or Maya user, unfortunately, you'll have to get used to Cryengine. Z is up. Z is up. Cryengine is a Y forward game engine. Plus value on the Y-axis is forward direction. Something to keep in mind when you're building your assets. Okay, so back to Environment Editor. So now I have my sandbox tutorial, I called it. I click on it, and now I load it, and it is now my active environment settings. And now you're going to see all of the things that control how the sun looks, and how the moon looks, and how the stars look. There are many, many, many environment settings. So the most basic thing I could do is change the latitude and longitude of the sun. If I want it to be lower in the sky, instead of overhead at a 90-degree angle, I could lower this down to maybe 25 degrees. And now if I rotate around it, I see a very strong shadow. The sun is very much coming from one direction. If I look around, you'll see the sun is over there. That's the bright part of the sky. And over here is the darker part of the sky. So all I did was change the longitude, so now the sun is lower. I'm moving farther from the equator. Okay? The other thing is to change the time of day, and that's this thing here that's called Curve Editor. So I can go to dark, and I'll automatically see stars. This is very close to midnight. There's the moon. I can change the position of the moon. I can change the size of the moon. And once I get to sunrise, the sun comes up over the horizon. It'll change colors throughout the day. You can see it moving through the sky. But my point is, just to change the longitude and the time of day makes it a lot easier to see your model and your texture. One trick, this is kind of important, any edits to these environment presets have to be saved within the environment editor. And you'll notice this asterisk. This little symbol says, these changes have not yet been saved. And you'll see this a lot of places in Cryengine. So make sure you Control S while you're in the environment editor to save the preset, because it's not the same thing as saving the whole level. 2 different things. Saving the level does not save the environment preset. You can also load other environment presets. If you click on these, you'll notice there's some kind of colorful and interesting ones here. So you can study these and get some ideas for how you want things to look. If you're doing simulations, you need very precise coordinates on planet Earth. Certain time of day, you can do that in Cryengine. It will be physically accurate. Okay, we're done with this for now, so I'm going to close the environment editor because it takes up a lot of space. And I'm going to rename this thing Pyramid, because that's what it is. And here's what I want to do. I want to control the way this moves. I want to make it like a bell. By the way, once you get these tools the way you like them, you've got them arranged for your monitors, your resolution, you're going to want to save that layout so that you don't lose it. And that's under the Layout menu, Save Layout As. I usually name these that describes how many monitors and what the resolution is. So in this case, it's one HD monitor, so I'd say Brian HD. Or if it's dual monitors, I may say tools on the left, perspective viewport on the right, whatever makes sense to you. But save these layouts, because if you're doing different tasks in Cryengine, it can be useful to change between tool layouts. What you don't want to do is constantly be sort of moving them around. Here's what I want to do. I want to make this pyramid hang in the air like a bell, and I want it to swing in the wind. If any force acts on it, I just want it to swing. So we call that a physics constraint. I'm not getting into animation, and I'm not showing you how to script movement. So in order to show you the sort of physical world of the engine, we're going to do a bit of physics. So select the object, click on Add Component, and you'll see a group called Physics Constraints. And what I'm interested in first is something called a point constraint. If you look really closely, you'll see a little yellow ball, but it's probably hidden in the middle of the object. Here's a trick. Go to Wireframe View. It's Alt-W on the keyboard, and it just shows you transparent models, Wireframe View. And you can toggle it on and off. There's also a View Modes toolbar up here that I suggest you turn on, View Modes, and you'll see that Wireframe is one of the options up there. Alt-W for Wireframe. If you turn on the physics and grab your Pull Physics tool, you can now spin this thing around that constraint. That point is a pivot. It can't fall, it's frozen in the air, but it can only move around that point. Okay, here's the thing though, this doesn't really behave the way I want it to, because I don't want to rotate it about the middle, I want to rotate about the top. So I want to offset the position of the constraint up. So you'll notice, if you turn off your physics, turn off physics, the mesh has its own transform properties. So I can move the mesh offset from the container, right? I can move the whole entity, and I can move every component separately. The container can be positioned in the world and rotated, and every component within that has its own position and rotation and scale. So I don't want to change the mesh, I want to change the position of the point constraint, and specifically I want to go up till it's right there. So I just went up on the z-axis, what, 0.3, 0.4 meters? And now if you test it again, now it really behaves like a bell. And it swings very nicely from the top point. If you look, you may have noticed that the position of the entity is relative to the terrain. So I'm right in the middle at 512, 512. So it's an absolute position. But the components that are attached to this entity, their coordinates are relative to the position of the whole entity. They're local coordinates. Do you understand? It's like a parent-child relationship. So I'm at 0 because I'm in the middle on x and y, but I'm 40 centimeters above the middle of the entity with my constraint. Really important distinction. When we link entities and we have a parent-child, it's the same kind of thing. Point constraint I started with because it's the most simple. It's a really nice way to make something pivot. And if you want to limit it, you can start to do that here. So in the point constraint properties, the YZ angle is how much it can swing. So for instance, if I just make this 30 degrees and then test it again, there's now going to be a limit to how far I can swing it. And you'll see this kind of cone that tries to show you a 30-degree angle, well, 30 on both in all directions. Do you see what I mean? I changed the maximum YZ angle property. The other two properties, the minimum and maximum, are twist. And if you leave it at 0, it's free to move 360 degrees. If I change these, and let's say I say, well, it can spin, it can twist just 20 degrees counterclockwise and 20 degrees clockwise. So you can make this very, very specific. You see, I can only spin it now, 20 degrees to the left, 20 degrees to the right. And I can't swing it at all. It's really useful when we start to build machines, something that should have mechanical relationship. Okay, let's do another one. I'm going to actually leave this one and I'm going to copy and paste it. And I'm going to take my copy and move it over here. And just to make it look a little bit different, I'm going to change the mesh again and make this one a cube. I'm going to remove the point constraint and we're going to use a different one called a line constraint. So to remove a component, I click on this box right here. Next to the name of the component, there's a very small menu that just says remove. I'm not removing the entity container, I'm not removing the mesh or the rigid body, I'm just removing the point constraint component. This time, what I want the box to do, I just want it to slide back and forth. Like if you go to the fun fair and you try to shoot the target, the little bird slides back and forth, that's what I want to do. That's called a line constraint. So the same idea, add component, physics constraints. If you know what you're looking for, you can just start to type LIN and you'll find it very quickly. And you should see a yellow line. If you don't see it, try your wireframe view. And by default, it's going to be up and down. Okay, I don't want this to move up and down. You can try it if you like. Let's say, do you have these things where you go to the carnival and you try and use the giant hammer and hit the thing and it goes up and rings the bell? That's basically what you've just made. However, we need to make it move further. So if we wanted to control the range, I'm going to zoom back a little bit and I'm going to go to the minimum and maximum limit. By default, it can only move up 1 meter. I'm going to say, hey, you can move up 10 meters. If you want it to move up and down, then you can set the minimum limit, except my minimum should be a negative number, sorry. -2 is what I meant to type. So when I turn on my physics, it's going to fall down 2 meters. I'm going to turn off my resting property. So the first thing that happens is it falls, and then I can use my pull physics tool and send it up again. So how do we change the axis? If I don't want vertical, but I want horizontal, here's where things get interesting. So if you go to the line constraint properties, you'll see something called axis. And this is a little bit tricky. I don't want to slide up and down, so I'm going to change this z-axis to 0. And I want to say, I want to slide along the x-axis. So I'm going to give it a value of 1, which means normal, right, full movement on x. And now you see this horizontal guy like this. Now what if we want to combine? What if we want to do an angle like this? So we're going to have a positive value on z and a positive value on x and y. And if you have all three positive, then you're going to rotate this axis, right, at different angles. But it's never going to be more than 1. And if they're shared, it's going to be less than 1. So for instance, if I've got 1 on x and I type a 1 in the z value, I'm going to end up with a 45-degree angle going up along the x-axis at a 45-degree angle. So it's really useful for building mechanisms, right? So you see that it slides according to gravity, and I can kind of throw it up in the air. I've got plus or minus 4 meters in my case. Okay, last but not least, let's try the plane constraint. This is as far as we go with the basic constraint types. There are much more complicated ways to constrain movement, but these are the basic types. So I'm going to remove my line constraint, and I'm going to add a plane constraint, which is movement along 2 axes simultaneously. And by default, this is what it should look like. It'll float in the air, and you can move it horizontally, but not vertically. And again, you can offset the position of the constraint, and you can angle it if you introduce a z value. It's like WALL-E, kind of zooming around the world. Now, here's an important tip. We haven't talked about something called damping. Remember we had the wind, and when the ball fell to the ground, the ball started rolling? Well, a funny thing is that ball would roll forever. Even if the wind was turned off, once I gave it a push, it would keep rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling. And the reason is math. As we get closer and closer to 0, and a calculation curve like this, those numbers get smaller and smaller and smaller, and we're approaching infinity. And those calculations become pointless and meaningless. So how we get around that is introduce artificial damping, which says, I'm going to put the brakes on. It's just brakes. So I suggest that you do introduce some kind of damping force so that things don't move forever, unless they're guaranteed to collide with something. So there is damping on entities. So that constrains the movement of the entity in the world. Small values are going to be your friend, like 0.1 to 0.4. But if you look on the constraint, it has its own damping value. And I do suggest that you put some kind of positive value in there. Again, between 0.1 and 0.4 is a good starting point. Otherwise, for instance, on the bell, it would just swing and swing and swing and swing, which isn't very real. You can also try very high values, and you'll see that the object will slow down very quickly, but it doesn't look very real. It doesn't look like physics anymore. So constraints, super, super powerful. You can make interlinking mechanisms. There are much more advanced constraints. For instance, we have constraints to make gears. So if you want gears to affect each other and move in synchronized, we can constrain movement to a spline path. Okay, I want to talk briefly about mass versus density. So I've got my ball here, and remove the constraint. So give yourself some kind of sphere, no constraints, and I'm going to move it over here a little bit. I'm going to change my mass to 1 kilogram. Oh, and make sure that the resting property is off. So you can either specify the mass and then the engine calculates the density, or you can specify density and the engine is going to calculate the mass. And that's here under physics settings, weight type. If you just want to have something that's not movable, you can just say immovable. So it doesn't really matter what it weighs. It can't be moved. It doesn't need mass. But normally we'd use a different entity type for that called a brush. I can also scale this up. So if you go to the mesh properties, and I'm going to synchronize X, Y, and Z, this little button here is synchronize. And I'm going to change the scale of the mesh to 10 meters. And I'm lost inside it right now, but now I have a much bigger ball. And instead of mass, I'm going to choose density. And I'm going to set that to 1. And if you enable physics, you've made a balloon. It is the same density as air. So in Cryengine, it's very easy to remember. The density of air is 1, and the density of water is 1,000. So if you want something to float in either of those atmospheres, you have to match the density. This is neutral buoyancy. If I make it 1,000, it will float in water. Try turning off your physics and make it 1.1. Now it's like you've got a balloon filled with air, and the weight of the rubber is making it sink slowly. If you make it anything less than 1, now it's helium. It's going to rise. Positive buoyancy. Super important concept if you're doing anything with water, but also if you want anything to float in the air. Okay, let's work with water a little bit and with the terrain. So here's my terrain height map. Can you go to the Tools menu and choose Terrain Editor? And I'm going to zoom out quite a bit so I can kind of see a bigger piece of the terrain. And the first tool that I'm going to choose is Raise/Lower. And this is just an easy way to make the terrain dip down and go up. My brush is circular, and my radius is over here. So for instance, I can say I want to make a hill that's 20 meters wide, and I don't want straight edges, so I want to kind of fall away. Make your hardness 1. Which means the brush is going to be 100% strength. And I'm just going to raise it up 5 meters. So my height is 5. I'm going to raise the ground up wherever I touch it, 5 meters, and a 30-meter radius on the outside. So this is what it looks like. As I drag with the brush, with my paintbrush, now I'm making these quite steep hills. So my inside radius is 20, my outside radius is 30. And each time I click, I keep raising it up, 5 meters, 5 meters, 5 meters. So now I've made some quick hills. They don't look very real because the way that hills are made in real life, as you know, is erosion, rain, that kind of thing. And for that, we need something procedural. Here's a quick trick. Hold down the Control key, and now it'll make the number reversed. You'll push the terrain down. And if you push it down far enough, you're going to see water. And that's actually the ocean, which has been hiding under the terrain all of this time. You just never seen it. So Control will invert it. If you have a negative number, it'll make it positive. Another quick trick, drag the mouse with the Alt key, and you'll change the softness of the edge. So the difference between inner radius and outer radius. If you want to make a cliff, you want them to be the same or almost the same. And then it goes straight up on the edges. If you want to do this gradually, so each time you paint, it does it a little bit, you can change the hardness value and lower it. 1 is full strength. If you make it less than 1, then it's going to be less than my limit, my 5 meters in this case. And you can do crazy things. You could type in 1,000 meters and make a giant, Tower of Mordor, or whatever floats your boat. Something really fun and crazy looking. How low do I have to go to get the water? So here's some important numbers. The default position of the terrain in Cryengine is 32 meters, not 0, 32 meters. You can set it to anything. If you want to do 0, do 0. That makes sense to me. It just happens to be at 32 meters. The default height of the ocean is 16 meters. So that gives you 16 meters to push the terrain down and make a sort of a lake. You could fill it with water or just, a hole in the ground before you actually hit the ocean. We have separate water volumes and rivers if you want to do that sort of thing. Here's the other thing is you can hide and show both the terrain and the ocean in the sandbox. That's not going to hide it in the game, but if you temporarily don't want to see it, you can use this menu here, and you can actually hide all of your entities by category. But what I want to do now is say, just turn off the terrain, and boom, there's the ocean. And if you come down close enough to it, you'll see that it has texture, it's moving in the wind, etc. So again, I'm using this menu, and all I did was turn off the terrain. If I turn that back on again, I can also turn off the ocean. I can hide that completely. It's still there, and it will be there in the game. It's not the same thing as erasing it or moving it. It just temporarily don't show it. Let's say you're building a game that only takes place in the ocean. And that means there is terrain, but the terrain is way below the water level. Okay? I could hand sculpt it, or I could import a height map, right, that has accurate data of what the underwater terrain is like, and push it way down. Or I could kind of quickly just move the terrain under the water in the terrain editor. So in this menu here, Edit, I have Set Ocean Height. So for instance, my terrain is at 32 meters right now. If I set the ocean higher than that, I'm going to try maybe 34 and come back up to one of my entities. Since I made some hills here, you'll see that now I have kind of an island. So only the parts that I raised up are visible, and the rest of the terrain is now below the water because I moved the ocean up to 34 meters high. You can do minus 100,000, deeper than the real ocean. You can also generate data procedurally. I'm going to go ahead and set my ocean back to 16, where it was. And if you look again in the terrain editor menu under File, you'll see Generate Terrain. And this generates procedural terrain that'll look a lot more realistic. However, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't correspond to the real world. But if you're curious, you can try this, and you'll see that we'll suddenly have some interesting kind of mountains. This is not random. If you set the same values, you'll get exactly the same procedurally generated terrain. You may find yourself under the terrain, which looks like this on the camera. If you don't want the camera to be able to go below the ground, there's a setting here in the perspective viewport, which is Camera Terrain Collisions. If it's off, you can fly right through the ground. If you turn it on, that will never happen. You can also make the camera bump into objects. So any physical mesh, the camera will go past it. It won't go through it. By the way, your entities may have disappeared under the ground, right? Remember the Control-Shift-Click trick? So I've got an entity selected, I could Control-Shift, and now it's sitting on top of this mountain. Same thing with this one. Control-Shift, boom, there it is. Snaps the pivot of the object to the terrain. We're going to make some lakes and make some rivers, but before we do that, I want to point out an important lighting thing. One of the basic things you're going to do is make the lighting more real. Do you see how the shadows are black? There are two ways to address this. One is to use ray tracing, which we call SVOGI in our system, one bounce ray tracing, but it's expensive. One of the things you want to do that's more basic is use some ambient light, some indirect lighting, okay? And we do that through what's called an environment probe. So, and I'm going to add a component. So create object, component, and I want an environment probe, which you're going to find under lights. Not environment, which is under audio, but environment probe, which is a lighting component. And what it's going to do is calculate proper specular reflections. So if I have like direct bounce, so a complementary angle, the light bounces off a surface and it bounces off at an exact complementary angle, and I get a little bright spot. And if it's a shiny material, I get a very small, precise bright spot. If it's like brick or something, it's barely visible. It depends on the specularity of the material. So specular reflections, we need calculated, and environment probe is going to calculate those. And it's also going to calculate some indirect lighting, and it's going to make a huge difference in our shadows. So place your environment probe in the level somewhere. And come in close to it. You should see a little box like this, yellow lined box. Make sure your helpers are on. So here's a very important general guideline. Every time you make a project, a level, you need to have at least one environment probe. It should be in the middle of the level, and it should be as big as the whole height map. Everywhere the player is going to go, this needs to cover it. And the height also needs to be as high as there are things to reflect. So usually we put this thing at eye level, but if there are any objects that should be calculated in the reflections, right, it should include that. So if you go over to the properties of the environment probe, you see box size. By default, it's 10 by 10 by 10 meters. And I'm going to change this to the same size as the terrain, which is 1024 by 1024. You may have made a different size terrain. And I'm going to make it quite high because I have mountains. I'll say 500 meters. So that's my size, and now I need to position it. How do I get it exactly in the middle of the level? Right up here. Transform, position. These should both be 512. And you can put it a bit above the terrain. It's 500 meters high, so it's pretty big. And I'm going to get it to come up out of the ground. And it should look like a ball, like this. It's going to be quite dark right now. And now is a good time to save, because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to require some serious computation. Think about the helpers. At some point they disappear, so that yellow box disappears when I get very far away. These are preferences. You may have noticed that when I select an object, it doesn't turn orange, and that's one of these preferences. So Edit, Preferences, and if you come down here to Helpers, you can control how far away they go before they're hidden. And you can also say never hide them. So you could turn off hide helpers in distance, and that way they're always visible. That tends to not work very well when I get into a complicated level with thousands of entities. So usually most of us like to hide them, but sometimes you want to hide them, only when they're 300 meters away. Sometimes you're working with a very dense area of entities, and you want to hide them when they're 15 meters away. But this is how you do it. You can hide them, and you can also shrink the helper, which is that little box, that kind of 9-point grid. You can shrink them down, which is a cue that's an object further away. Otherwise, it's very hard to tell when you have hundreds of helpers on top of each other what is what. The labels are the actual names, and they have their own controls. Another thing that's cool to change is how the selection tool works. And so what I did was just change this setting called Geometry Highlight Alpha, and I made it 0. So that way that orange indicator, when you have an object selected, doesn't hide the material. It doesn't hide how the actual entity looks. And you can change the colors of the helpers. You can do anything you want. You can completely customize this. OK, so I've positioned this thing dead center, and now I actually need to generate what are called cube maps. If you pretend I have a cube, and it has 6 pictures, top, bottom, front, center, left, right. And so it says, what does the world look like over here? What's the world look like above me, below me, this way, and that way? It literally takes 6 pictures. And then it reflects those on this sphere. And so that all the objects then use this map of what the world looks like, and it creates correct reflections. This is a baked map. All lighting in Cryengine is real time, except environment probe cube maps. They are baked. So next important thing you need to know, if your lighting changes or your level design changes, you need to regenerate the cube map. How do we generate it in the first place? You've got your probe selected, and all the way at the bottom you'll see a button that says generate. But before you do that, you might want to also consider how high resolution do you need these reflections to be. The bigger this number, the more expensive, the more memory it takes. And game engines are very intense on the computer, and when you have thousands of assets, optimizing the performance of your simulation or your game becomes a serious concern. So this is something you can experiment with later. For now, I'm going to say 512, which is fine. And this generating will take a minute. As long as the button is blue, it's still calculating all of the reflections in the scene. And eventually it should go away. And now the ball should be shiny. So if you go to it, now if you look around, you see how it reflects the world? Do you see? Now I have a silver shiny ball, a reflection of everything on every side of it. And that's called a cube map. If I put other shiny objects in the scene, I should have correct specular reflections, and I also fixed the black shadow problem. So you see how my shadows are much lighter now? If you make this inactive, turn the active on and off, you'll see what a difference this is making. This is without it, this is with it. Indirect lighting and also specular reflections. Okay, now here's how we tweak it to look the way you want it. We can do many creative things. It's kind of like a light. In cinematography terms, we'd call this a fill light, our indirect soft light source. And I'm going to name it environment probe _ global. Here's a tip that I didn't tell you. Before you generate your cube map, it's a really good practice to name your environment probe, because the cube map is a series of TIFF files, and they're going to take on the name of the entity. And once you've generated it, you can't change it. It's not a big deal, but for organizational purposes, it's nice to name the probe first. as soon as you start to create vehicles or buildings, every room would have an additional local environment probe as big as the room. Inside every room of a submarine or a plane or a building, every one of them would have a separate environment probe. That's how you're going to get good looking lighting. So what can we do with this? Well, we have something called diffuse multiplier, which is the brightness of this light, and we can change its color. So if you click on this color swatch and go red, you'll notice all of your shadows are now red. So I'm scattering red light into the shadows. The diffuse multiplier is how strong it is. So the bigger I make that number, the lighter the shadows are going to become. If you want it more subtle, make it less than 1. You can make it 0.01 if you like. We don't have anything shiny in our scene yet, but we can also change how bright the specular reflections are. A common use of this would be if you're outside and you want the shadows to be slightly blue because they're filled by the sky. The sky acts as a secondary light source and fills in the shadows, and they're quite blue, as the Impressionists noticed about 150 years ago. So for instance, I might want to tint these shadows a little bit on the blue side and maybe not quite so strong, something like this. So this is off, this is on. To me, this is a little too strong, so I'd probably lower this diffuse multiplier a bit. Maybe something like that. I've got 0.3, which I think looks good. So let's take a quick look at water. So I'm going to find a kind of a spot here that seems like a good place for a lake. And I think what we should do real quick is add a terrain material. So I'm kind of tired of looking at this grid. It'd be good to see maybe some grass or mud, some trees, that kind of thing. So first I'm going to make some materials. So I want to go to my terrain editor, and instead of sculpt, where I can push the terrain up and down, I want to choose paint. And this is terrain textures. So again, like this carpet, it's a pattern like a swatch of grass or mud or flowers, bushes, and I'm just going to tile it across the terrain. This works in layers, and I have a default layer right here. I'm not going to actually use it right now. I'm going to make my own. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say create layer. And I'm going to double click to rename it, and I'm just going to call this mud, or maybe sand is better. I need to pick a material, and this is why I put the GameSDK assets in here, so we have some things to play with. So I want to go down to the material folder. You may want to move this split point up and click on the browse button, the little folder. And not in the engine folder. There are no assets in the engine folder, but in the assets folder under materials, you should see a folder called terrain. And I'm going to search for the word sand in this folder, and I should see all the materials that have some kind of sand. And you can pick whatever one you like. It doesn't really matter. I'll say rough sand A. You're not going to see anything happen yet. You're just picking the material. We have a new layer called sand, and we have a material assigned to that layer called sand. Before we start painting it on the terrain, if you think about the real world, if we have sand, loose sand, it's not going to be on a cliff because gravity would just push it down or wind would blow it out of the way. So what I want to do is only apply the sand where it would actually be. So I don't want the terrain to be too steep. And also, as I get up into the mountains, instead of sand, I may just have rock. If I get underwater, I may have wet sand. So in other words, I want to filter my material by altitude and by slope. And you'll see those properties right here. So I'm going to say, well, maybe only up to 300 meters high, and the angle only up to, 35 degrees. I don't see dry sand hanging on a hill steeper than that. You can try anything you like. You can click on the paint button, and just like in the terrain sculpting brush, you can change the size, You can use Alt to change the size, and you'll see that it only applies it on spots that match that criteria. And you may need to do a little searching until you find that. So when I get on this really steep hill, it's steeper than 35 degrees, so no sand. So you can hand paint this and decorate your level this way. We're in a hurry though. We don't have days to build our terrain, so we're going to cheat. We're going to just tell it, go over the whole terrain, and any place that meets this criteria, go ahead and apply the sand. Any place between 0 and 35 degrees, between 0 and 300 meters high, apply the texture. And here's how we do it. We're just going to right click on the name of the paint layer and say flood layer. It'll take a minute, and if your terrain is bigger, it can take a couple of minutes. And now if we look, the entire level should have sand any place that meets that criteria. Try adding another paint layer. Try and find a rock and maybe put that up higher in the mountains or any place that's steep, let's say from 35 to 90 degrees, just to kind of fill out our level a bit. By the way, make sure you only use terrain materials. The terrain materials use the terrain shader. Other kinds of materials aren't going to be appropriate for use on a terrain. I'm going to look for some rock here. So now I've got my two different textures. You'll see on the steep parts I've got rock, and the shallower parts I have sand. Mine kind of look very similar, so it's not that different. Okay, let's make a lake. By the way, make sure your paint tool is turned off. We're done with this. We're going to need properties again. Try and find a spot in the mountains where it sort of makes sense to make a lake. Like I'm going to choose this sort of low spot. And I'm actually going to use my terrain editor and my sculpt tool, and I'm going to lower it even a bit more. So I'm going to say, I don't know, push it down maybe 10 meters, something like that. I went down so far I'm seeing the ocean, which I actually don't want to do, so I'm raising mine up a little bit. Okay, something like that. Any hole will do, it doesn't really matter. And I want to go to Create Object Area. This is not a component. I need to make a water volume. So Create Object Area Water Volume. And the trick to doing this is put the points of your shape, this is going to be a straight line shape, put them outside of the lake. I'm actually going to put the points of my area outside that, higher than that, just a little bit above the hill like that. And what I want to do is snap the points to the terrain. There's snapping up here. You can snap so when you move things, it jumps 1 meter, 2 meters. You can snap when you rotate things to angles. You can snap the scaling. And here is snap to terrain, which is T. So anything you drag into the world will stick to the terrain. So the letter T, or you can go right here and choose toggle snapping to terrain. And you should see a little box sitting on the mountains straight up. Terrain normals means it's going to be perpendicular to the surface of the terrain. So as we have a hill, it's going to be like this. That's not what we want. We just want terrain. So the box should be straight, not cocked. The keyboard shortcuts for this are T and N. N is N normals. I just want T. Okay, and now I'm ready to draw my box. And here's where it might be good to make your helpers visible a long ways away. And all I'm doing is kind of going around very quickly and making these points that are going to become the edge of my lake. And when I get done, I want to double click. You should see something like this. If you're having trouble seeing it, because when you get far away it keeps disappearing, go to your preferences and your helpers, and I'm going to make my distance, my hide distance, much further. So let's say 250 meters. So now I can go much further away and I can still see my lake. Should look something like this. Don't worry about the different heights. We'll fix that in a second. So I've got two problems. One is it's not perfect along the edges. I'll need to edit the shape. And the other thing is some of my points are up here, some of my points are down here. Water doesn't do that. Water's flat. So first thing is I want to make them all the same position. What's an easy way to do that? Scale on the z-axis. Just scale the z-axis down, 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 down. So I'm going to use my scaling tool, which is here, the 3 key, this gizmo here. And I've got the entity selected. And I'm just going to grab this box, which is scaling vertically, and drag down, 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 down. I may need to do it 2 or 3 times. And all of those points, the height of the points is all going to equalize like this. You see what it's doing? I'm reducing the distance over which the points are distributed on the vertical axis. And once I've done that, now I can kind of take my whole lake and move it down so it touches the edges. So I scaled. I'm going to move it down and decide what's the height of the water going to be. All right, I'm not sure exactly. It looks like I'm going to have an island in the middle of my lake, which is fine. Okay, and now if I need to fix some of these edges, I can say in the Properties panel, edit shape, and I can select individual points and I can move them. If you want to add points, control click. So for instance here, control click, now I've got a new point and I can move it around. Don't move it up or down, just move it sideways. And when you're done, don't forget to turn off edit shape or click this X. Don't worry that it's perfect yet. It'll be easier once we actually add the water material and you can see where it's not sort of reaching the edges. Just kind of get close and then we'll continue. Let me show you how to add the material. You may find it easier to edit this if you can actually see the water. I'm going to save. I've got the water volume properties and I'm going to go to Material. Under the Properties, General, Material, Browse, and find the folder called Water under Materials and pick like Rough Water A or something like that. Any water that you like the looks of. If you haven't tried it already, you can perfect the layout. That's not the point. Move the camera under the water and you'll see that you're going to see turbulence, fluid dynamics, all that stuff. So any kind of water volume, which includes rivers, water volumes in the ocean, you can set the properties. If you want to change, if you're in the tropics versus you're in, a muddy stream, you can change the fog level. Okay, let's go back and find your objects that you created. Find one of these objects. Make sure you save your level. We haven't looked at materials yet except for the water material. And let's actually add a material to your mesh. So in the mesh properties, if you look at your mesh component, there's a material property and there's a browse button next to that. And if you look in the assets folder under materials, you'll find some generic materials. In fact, literally there's a folder called generic. So mesh, material, click on the browse button. Under materials, generic, you'll find things like wood, brick, mud, grass, marble, metals. So for instance, there's a kind of a yellow metal like that. Okay, important tool that I need to introduce you to. The more time you spend with the engine, the more familiar you become with it, and the more you will use this expert tool called the console. And I don't mean expert like it's hard to use, it's actually very simple, but you have to know what to type. It is literally like a command line. So you have to know what it is you're looking for. The good news is that if you can sort of guess what the English word might be, you might find surprises. So for instance, I know that Cryengine has clouds. It has three-dimensional procedural volumetric clouds. How do I turn them on? Well, there's a console variable for it, and it probably includes the word cloud. So if I start typing the word clouds, sure enough, now I've whittled it down from 80,000 console variables to, 7 or 8. And it turns out it's R volumetric clouds. And if I highlight it with the arrow key and press Tab, now it's actually getting typed for me, so I don't have to finish typing it. And if I want to know what the possible values of a console variable are, type a question mark. And it'll say there's only 3 possibilities. Off or kind of high resolution, low resolution. So I'm going to say up arrow to repeat the same command. I'm going to backspace and I say, well, show me the half resolution clouds. And lo and behold, now if you look up at the sky, we have beautiful clouds. And the wind moves them, by the way. There are tens of thousands of CVARs, console variables. You will get familiar with them as you work. When you get to the point where you're debugging and you're optimizing your game, you'll want to look at performance. Here's a tip. If you look at this menu next to the H, you see additional options. These are also controlled by CVARs, console variables. In fact, almost everything can be controlled by a console variable. So the experts love these because they just sort of memorize them. So for instance, if you want to turn on labels, or let's say bounding boxes, if I go back to my entity, you see this white box around it? That can be controlled by a variable. You'll find other things related to memory and performance. I can turn on various levels of help. If I want to see the dimensions of things, I can turn that on. There's all sorts of things that you can toggle on and off. Like I said, you'll also see these in the CVARs. Here's a tip. Look under the console tool in the menu, Help, and you'll see 2 other tools related to this, which is just a list of every single console variable organized either just alphabetically or by category. So this console commands one is really nice because it's organized by category. everything related to cameras or AI or the 3D modeling tool, lighting, etc. And you can sort of browse through these and you'll see nice descriptions of what they do. And this is a good way to learn about some of these. Again, as you become more expert, it's just fastest to type in the command if you know it rather than search in the Sandbox GUI. But in the beginning, this is all very foreign, so it doesn't make any sense. So I have this kind of yellow material here. If you want to see or edit the material, we need to use the material editor. And there's an old version and a new version. They do exactly the same thing. Some people prefer the old one, some people prefer the new one. The difference is almost nothing but font size. The Sandbox team would kill me for saying that, but I'm sure there are other differences. You can explore either one, and they're right here in the tools. I'm going to use Material Editor Legacy because I'm just more familiar with it. It's just easier for me, but you're welcome to also use Material Editor. It's exactly the same tool. And I'm going to put it here. And this is a big tool. There are a lot of settings to a material, so I'm going to make it pretty big. I've got an object selected that has something, and what I want to do is get the properties from that object. So the third button on the material editor is called Get Properties from Selection. Whatever object is selected, it's going to grab the material and it's going to open it up in the material editor so you can see exactly how it's built. It goes from the entity into the material editor. It says, open up that material for editing. Now these materials that I gave you are read-only because they're in these compressed pack files. So you can't make permanent changes to one of them. You can copy one of them and then edit the copy, but you can't edit them. But you can get familiar with this. So for instance, probably the most important factor for any kind of texture is the diffuse texture. If these are new terms, you're not an artist, don't worry about this. If you're a programmer, you don't necessarily need to understand. But essentially, this is what you would think of as what I can see, the yellow metal-looking texture. And if you roll the mouse over this, you'll get this preview image that will pop up. You get a little square version of the picture that'll pop up on the screen eventually, and you can kind of get a look at it. I roll over the word diffuse, and I can see a preview of it, and I can see a histogram that shows, the colors. There are also textures to make the surface bumpy. We can do displacement, and we have a plugin for Photoshop so that you can generate all these textures properly from whatever sources you're using. Let's try changing materials from here. So for instance, instead of metal, I'm going to find a glass material, maybe something like this. And if I want to assign it to the object, I'm going to use this first button, Assign Item to Selected Objects. Now the tricky thing about this is if you're using entity components, that's not going to work because it's assigning the material to the container, not to the mesh component. So you're still going to have to go to the mesh component here, go to Material, and browse to the correct folder. So for instance, glass squares, and there's my glass squares material. It's not assigned to the entity container, it's assigned to the mesh component. Let's look at something more complex and something we haven't done yet. If you go to the Create Object tool, we have something called brush. A brush is a non-movable object. We use them for things like very big rocks, mountains, buildings, anything that isn't going to move. So what I want to do is I'm going to go maybe down to the beach at the edge of my terrain, and I'm going to kind of put a building down there, somewhere down here. And I'm going to go Create Object, Brush, and under the Objects folder, you'll see Architecture, Buildings, and I'm going to choose quite a big one, which is the sort of hangar. And I'm going to drag that onto my terrain. So here's a little trick. There are two ways to do this. You can drag it and drop it, or what I prefer to do is double click. And the reason I like to double click is as I'm placing it, I can use my scroll wheel to spin it. I can use my scroll wheel to position the angle of it and spin it around the z-axis before I drop it. So I double clicked on the CGF of the hangar. I'm using my mouse, and let's say I want it to face the ocean and sit on the terrain there, and then I click, and there it is. Now, of course, my terrain isn't flat there. I'd need to flatten it out, which I'll do in a second. But get that building or one of the buildings somewhere on the terrain, and then we'll flatten the terrain under it. OK, let's flatten the terrain under it. So I'm going to go back to my terrain editor and choose Flatten. And here's the thing is, I want it to sit kind of where it is. What I want to do is say whatever this side is, That's what I want my sort of default point to be. In other words, I want it to sit in the terrain back there, so what I need to do is lower the hill behind it. I don't want to build up the ground in the front part. I want to lower the hill, the mountain, sort of the back part. So in other words, what I'm saying is I'd like to know what the height of this is and use that for my flatten tool. So it's a make everything where I paint the height of this. So here's how it works. I choose flatten, choose how big my brush is. This hanger is like 34 by 20 meters, 35 and 30. I'll make my hardness 1. And instead of just guessing how high I want it to be, I'm going to use the eyedropper. So I'm going to sample with the eyedropper the terrain right here. And now when I start painting, I get this. And so I made everything the sort of same height. And now I can actually Control-Shift-Click to snap the hanger onto the ground, because I made it a little bit lower than I wanted to. I want to point out one thing about the terrain sculpting tools. You can reposition objects while you're doing this. So I could force the hanger to keep falling down or going up as I'm raising and lowering the terrain, and that's reposition objects. So if I do this again, anything that's already in the terrain would actually move. Let me go ahead and try a different one, like this. And you see how it moves? And I move it down again, something like this. And you see how the hanger keeps snapping to the terrain as it moves? So it can be useful sometimes. Let me just briefly show you Vegetation Editor. So under Tools, Vegetation Editor, let's add some trees. You can actually use this to paint any object. You could scatter hangers, you could scatter birds, you could scatter rocks, bushes. It's not just vegetation, it's any CGF model. But it's usually something you want to paint over a large area. So we follow these steps. First we got to make a group, and I'm going to double click and rename this, and I'm going to call this aspen trees, because that's what I'm going to put on this, kind of like paint layers in the terrain tool. Maybe I put my rocks on another group. We call these groups, not layers, but it's effectively the same thing. And I want to make sure it's visible, so I click the checkbox. And with it selected, now I'm going to add individual models. So that's this guy, Add Object, the second button. And now I'm going to go through and browse. And again, in my Objects folder under Natural, you're going to find a bunch of trees. And what I'm going to do is just use some of the aspens. So for instance, Aspen A. You could actually Control-Click to select multiple trees. So I could add, all the tall trees in one group. I could add, all the bushes in another group, whatever you want to do, because we have individual control over them anyway. It's just an organizational convenience. So I'm going to select a few of them and then expand this little triangle, and there's the aspens that I chose. So you just need at least one. And now what I'm going to do is select all of them right here, and I'm going to set the properties that are going to be common to all of the trees. And then I'm going to get more specific. For instance, the big trees I may want to spread apart more, whereas the small trees I may want to put closer together. But for now, I'm just going to do some common things, and I'm going to give you some recommendations. When you're doing this, you don't want these trees to be exactly alike, or it will be very obvious that you're using the same models over and over again. So a simple 2 ways to fix this is 1, vary the size, and 2, vary the rotation. And you can also choose to align it to the surface normals. Doesn't always make sense. Some trees grow straight up, like aspens. Oaks may grow up at funny angles, right? But a lot of trees grow straight. So my recommendation to you is to vary the size by 30%. So this parameter, size variation, I'm going to do 0.3. Anything more than that, it's not so much a problem shrinking. It's a problem when you blow up a model. You start to see the vertices and it doesn't look very real. You can test this yourself. I would definitely include random rotation. So it'll twist them at different angles, so they're not all facing the same way. Again, if you want to angle them somewhat to the terrain normals, you can do that, like this. And the most important thing is, how far apart are they? The default is 1 meter. And if you leave it this way, you're going to have just trees, trees, trees on top of trees. So I'm going to try something quite big, let's say 50 meters apart. Just like terrain textures, I can filter this by how steep the slope is, and how high the altitude is. So maybe these kind of trees only grow down closer to the ocean. And then when I get up in the mountains, I want pine trees. Or we don't want trees growing out of the side of a cliff, right? We want trees to grow on more gentle hills. So I'm going to say I don't want them down in the ocean, which is 16 meters. I'm going to start my trees at about 20 meters. And I don't want to go higher than maybe, I don't know, 200 meters. And I don't want them on a hill steeper than 35 degrees. That's pretty steep still. It just depends on the kind of tree, the kind of vegetation. Okay, so those are the properties in common. If you want to just affect one group of trees, now I could select other ones or control click to select multiples and say, well, the dead trees, I don't want so many of those. So maybe every 100 meters on the density. I don't want so many dead trees. It's not like there was a forest fire originally. But just get some settings. And now I'm going to select the whole group. Just click on the group, and I'm going to click on Paint. And I'm going to set the radius of my brush to be quite big. I'm going to say 100 meters in diameter. And I'm going to zoom way back, and I'm going to paint, and there, lo and behold, there are my trees. You can undo if they're too close together. It'll take a minute, and maybe spread them out a bit more, because I think mine are a bit too close together. Make my density, remember that I have them 50 meters apart, but I have like 7 different kinds of trees randomly distributed, so there's more overlap than you might think. By the way, full screen, control spacebar in the perspective viewport, kind of comes in handy in this sort of situation. And you see that I can't really get them all the way on the top of the mountains. I set my altitude maximum at 200 or something, so they stop growing up here. Now, come in and look closely at one tree and tell me what looks fake about it. There's something that an artist should notice that looks very fake. They're not moving, so that's a property called bending. This is radically going to make these more realistic. You don't need to be painting anymore. Just select all of your tree types, except the dead trees. Dead trees don't sway in the wind, so I'm not going to modify those if you happen to be using those. I'm just going to select the other trees, and I'm going to set my bending. Depends on how strong the wind is. I'll try maybe 5. And that looks pretty good to me. If you set it to a high number, you'll see ridiculous, rubbery trees that don't look very real. And again, this is directly affected by the real wind velocity. If you make the wind very strong, you may want to change this again. Like I said, something that shouldn't move, like a rock or a bush, something very stiff, like a dead tree, you should not use bending. In terms of performance, if you look in the display menu, you have something called graphics. And this just says, how good am I allowed to make your textures and your materials look? If you have a really nice graphics card, you can certainly try very high, and everything will look beautiful. Okay? But if your graphics card's not so great, you might want to lower the quality. It has nothing to do with the quality of the game that you deliver. It's just in the Sandbox Editor right now, how does it look? So if your performance on your computer is quite slow, you might want to lower this quality. Okay, just a general tip. How do you know whether you're getting good performance? Well, you can feel it, but also what you might want to do is look at your frames per second. This is the most basic piece of information. And that's what we call this display info right here, this button. And you can control how intense this is by holding the mouse button down and choosing low, medium, or high. High shows you lots of technical information about performance, memory usage, draw calls, lots of stuff that'll become more and more useful as you become more expert with the engine, and you build out your world and your performance starts to get slower and slower, and you start to be concerned, what exactly is making my game slow? And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of console variables that will show you much more in-depth information, like texture memory, how many vertices, how many polygons. It goes on and on and on and on. At the very least, I do suggest that you keep an eye on your frames per second. You can see I'm doing quite well. Even with the trees, I'm still up 200-something frames per second. So we usually target 30 frames per second for a finished game. 60 is nice. It takes a lot of work to get a AAA game to 60 frames per second in the end. One other thing about layers. We've only used one layer so far. Someone asked about the terrain layer. You don't need to worry about this. This isn't a a layer like the rest of them. It's really here to make it convenient to hide and show the terrain. However, notice that our only layer is blue. Do you see this blue icon? That's super important. That means it's the active layer. So any new entities I bring into the level are going to end up here. You need to pay attention to what the active layer is. You can double click to set it, or if you go to the menu, you can see Set as Active Layer. You should use layers a lot. Separate things by layers, it's very helpful. I should also tell you, if you're going to put stuff way in the background, no physics, proxies are simple shapes that represent this object for purpose of calculating collisions. So if it needs to know when the player bumps into this thing so the thing can fall over, we use a simplified version of this shape. It doesn't need to be so complicated. It would be a simple box. Okay, and it's invisible, the player doesn't see it. If you've got mountains, stuff way in the background just to kind of make things look good, but no one will go near it, no one will collide with it, I suggest that you use a separate layer for that sort of thing. So I'm going to say New Layer, and I'm just going to call this Background. And there are properties that you can assign to the layer. So for instance, under More, you can turn off physics per layer, which is a really cool thing. It can save a lot of performance. And you'll see a lot of other things. The other important thing for you to know about layers is you're probably, I guarantee, not going to be building your projects alone. You're going to have a team. And so for many people to work on the same project at the same time, you can check out the layers. If you use like a code management system like Perforce, this works directly with Perforce. So I can lock a layer while I'm working on it, no one else can touch it. They can have the same project open and they're working on separate layers. And then we can just update them so we get the latest copy. Let's stop.